Chapter 35. 1 year old. 1 week later. BB stared at himself in the square mirror that leaned against the wall, his eyes narrowed in concentration and his horn glowing with its signature green light. Eventide was sitting on the edge of his bed behind him, keeping a careful eye on the proceedings with a critical, albeit fascinated look on his face. They were in Eventide's bedroom, which was one of only 2 rooms that made up the second story of the new house, aside from an empty hallway where the staircase was. The other one was the second bathroom, which was connected to the bedroom, the door currently hanging partially open. The bedroom itself was larger than Eventide's old room, though not by a lot. His bed rested against one wall, the headboard meeting the wall with a window sat just over it. His dresser was off to the right of the bed, and his end table was off to the left. On the opposite end of the room was his computer desk, and to the wall to the left of that was the doorway that led to the bathroom. BB gave a grunt of effort, and a few flickers of green fire appeared on various parts of his body. He let out a groan, his wings buzzing instinctively with agitation and strain. He almost had it. He threw his head back as the flames swirled around him and consumed him. They crackled there for a few seconds, and then vanished as quickly as they had come. Eventide just stared at BB for a few minutes, seemingly baffled by what he was looking at. Then one of his hands flew up to cover his mouth, and he started laughing hysterically. BB spun around to pout at him indignantly.
"Hey, why are you laughing?"
he demanded in irritation. His question was answered when he heard his own voice. It was no longer distorted like it was in his normal state, but it also sounded like he was trying to talk with a few large marbles shoved into one of his cheeks. His brow furrowed, and he spun back around to look at himself in the mirror. Well, that explained that. He looked like someone had found a bunch of spare pieces of black border collie lying around somewhere and glued bits of them onto his chitin. One half of his head had become that of a dog, yes, but the other was still his normal self. The two blended into each other in a very uneven manner, vaguely resembling melted plastic. As if that wasn't unsettling enough, one of his forelegs had become that of a dog, but was still peppered with telltale holes going through them. He had ratty patches of black fur all over his body, one of his wings poked haphazardly out of his shell, and his tail was just straight up gone. BB peeled back his lip to get a look at his teeth, then cringed when he saw just how wrong he looked. He shook his head, sent a spark of magic through his horn, and there was another swirl of fire. When it faded, he had returned to normal. With a heavy sigh, he fell to his haunches and reached a hoof up to his chest, feeling the exertion coming on. His heart rate increased severely, and his head began to pound painfully in protest to the spell. Eventide's laughter finally died down in the background, and he came up behind BB to scoop him up into his arms. "All right, B. I think we're done for now," Eventide said in a soft voice, a few final giggles working out of him before he carried BB over to the bed and set him down. BB pouted again, giving his dad a rotten look.
"You laughed at me,"
he grumbled before turning his back on Eventide and sitting down with a childish huff. Kinda," Eventide said sheepishly with a shrug. He scratched the back of his head, then sat down on the bedside next to BB. He reached out and started to lightly scratch him behind the ears, and all was quickly forgiven. While BB chirped and leaned into his hand, Eventide continued. "I didn't mean to upset you or anything. I just wasn't expecting that to be the result, after 7 days of practice." BB hummed, still leaning into the pets and scritches.
"It's okay. It did look kind of funny,"
he admitted in a kind of drowsy voice. Eventide chuckled again. He wanted to say something more, but a sharp sound suddenly cut through the air, killing his sentence in his throat. It was the loud ringing of the doorbell, and Eventide immediately shot up to his feet on hearing it. He spun on his heels and grinned. About time! BB turned to watch Eventide and noticed that there was a lot of excitement surrounding him all of a sudden. Now, the man had been excited all day, but it had been contained and suppressed until now. And now it was bursting out of him uncontrollably, and filled the air with a taste that BB could best describe as being something similar to a lightly salted peanut butter cup. "B, stay put for a bit, eh?" Eventide called without looking as he ran for the exit to the room. BB frowned at the request and walked to stand at the edge of the bed. He watched as Eventide fled from the room before he had any chance to answer, closing the door behind him. There were several moments of silence, aside from the thumping of Eventide running down the stairs. BB tilted his head, then turned and made a quick buzzing hop over to the window. He propped himself up on the sill and swept his eyes back and forth across the front yard and driveway, looking for the new arrival. After only a second of scanning the environment, he looked down towards the front door and let out a happy and elated gasp. It was Fluttershy. He could just make out the top of her long pink hair from his position, and his wings began to buzz in excitement.
And Fluttershy!
Down below, Fluttershy lifted some kind of colorful paper bag as if to show it off. She then stepped into the house and disappeared from BB's view. He stayed there for several seconds before spinning around and buzzing over to the bedroom door. He fell to his haunches and looked up at it expectantly, much like Buddha would at the front door whenever Eventide was about to walk back into the house. Several minutes passed, and his smile grew when he heard the telltale thumping of Eventide's shoes on the return trip up the stairs. A moment passed, and the door swung open. Eventide stepped back in and grinned down at BB. The excitement was even brighter around him now. "Guess who's here?" he asked leadingly. BB hopped up into the air and did an excited backflip with the help of his wings.
And Fluttershy!
He all but shouted before rising higher and looking past Eventide's shoulder.
Where is she? I want to hug her!
Eventide chuckled and turned, gesturing for BB to go on ahead. "She's downstairs. Go say hi." BB giggled and did as he was instructed. He rocketed by Eventide's head with enough speed to make the tips of the young man's maroon hair flutter at his passing. BB was barely able to make out the sound of Eventide following him, but didn't pay that much attention. He hadn't seen Fluttershy since the move, and he was not going to miss a chance on seeing her. His active mind ground to an abrupt halt when he reached the bottom of the stairs, though. He faltered for a moment and perched on the base of the guardrail. From his position, the archway that led to the rest of the house was on the right, while the long kitchen counter that hugged the wall to the left. Oddly, though, the dining table had been moved from its place against the outer wall of the stairs and now sat in the very heart of the room. It was covered in a set of 4 boxes, each one wrapped in colorful paper. In the center of it, there was a large cake with smooth black frosting and bright blue edges, and a heavy coating of deep green sprinkles. It was in the shape of a heart. Fluttershy stood next to it, dressed in a warm-looking hoodie of a lively pale green and blue jeans. Her hands were clasped together behind her back, and she met BB's gaze with a warm and expectant smile on her face.
Surprise!
She cheered, albeit at a moderate volume. BB mouthed uselessly a few times, trying to get his thoughts together. Finally, he shook himself and managed to find his voice.
Is it Christmas again?
He asked tentatively before leaning forward so he could look out the window over the sink.
It's not snowing.
Fluttershy shook her head and giggled.
No, it isn't Christmas. It's your birthday.
She corrected before looking up the stairs at Eventide as he descended. He came to a stop next to BB, who now just looked confused. Eventide tilted his head, barely able to hide an eager smile. "Did I never tell you what a birthday is?" he asked quietly, and BB shook his head. Eventide nodded and crouched a little so his head was next to his son's. He placed a hand on his back and looked into his eyes. Well, exactly 1 year ago, you hatched from your egg and came into my life. 365 days ago, I met my son for the very first time.
Every year, people get just a little bit older.
Fluttershy continued with a nod.
And we celebrate those times when they turn a new year. They're special days for everyone, where friends and families get together and give presents and spend quality time with the birthday boy or girl.
Bibi looked up at Eventide with wide-eyed wonder. And Eventide continued on. It's been a year since you hatched, so, like Fluttershy just said, that means it's time to celebrate. We got you some presents, and she even had one of her friends custom make that cake for you.
And don't worry,
Fluttershy suddenly cut in.
As far as Pinkie knows, this cake could be for just about anyone, and I made her pinky promise not to ask anyone about it.
Eventide chuckled in amusement as he heard that. Oh, I bet she's just bursting with curiosity.
Oh, she is. But she made a pinky promise, and she won't break it.
Bibi tilted his head, clearly confused. He then looked on ahead at the boxes again and pointed.
So, those are all for me?
He asked, his voice timid, as if he were worried it was a bad question to ask. Fluttershy gave a nod.
Mm-hmm. Eventide and I both got you 2 presents. It's your first birthday after all. It's a special day,
she said before pointing at the cake.
And we know the cake won't feed you, but it still tastes good. I know. Pinkie made it.
Bibi looked at it all for a moment longer, taking it all in. Finally, his face lit up in an enormous grin of pure delight. He spun around and launched himself into a hug around Eventide's neck. But before the embrace could be returned, he spun around and flew over to hug Fluttershy, who, unlike Eventide, was ready. She wrapped her arms around him in return, and the two stayed like that for a little while before Bibi squirmed away and set himself down on the table. He looked at each present and the cake one at a time, studying them curiously. He then turned and smiled up at the other 2 people in the room.
Daddy, Fluttershy, can we open the presents now?
He asked in a hopeful chitter. Fluttershy and Eventide shared a knowing look. Eventide came forward until he was next to Fluttershy, and the 2 looked at Bibi with big smiles. There's one thing first, Bibi. And then, at the same time, Eventide and Fluttershy began to sing. Bibi's eyes went wide, and he fell to his haunches as the 2 people that he saw as his parents sang to him. He vaguely recalled a few times when he was still learning how to talk when Fluttershy had quietly sung to him when Eventide was out, but those had been wordless lullabies, something simple to make him relax and fall asleep. But this was different. It filled him with warmth and joy. As they finished, they both came down and scooped Bibi into a tight group hug, one which he only numbly returned. They remained like that for several seconds before Bibi regained his faculties and pulled back, an enormous and ecstatic beam splitting his face.
Oh, wow! You guys have never sung to me like that before!
Eventide shrugged. Probably for the best. I can't sing to save my life.
That's not true. I think you have a lovely singing voice.
Fluttershy chastised him playfully, before getting a thoughtful look on her face.
Although you could do with just a teensy bit of practice.
Eventide slowly blinked, then chuckled in amusement. You know, I think that's the closest thing to an insult I am ever gonna hear from you.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Eventide laughed again and shook his head. You're fine. Anyways, he looked down at Bibi and nodded at him to go ahead. Pick a present, Bibi. The bug nodded and turned around, surveying his options, They were in various sizes, and he found himself wishing that he could open them all at once. He briefly contemplated doing so with his magic, but in the end, decided it would be better if he did it one at a time. Eventually, his gaze settled on one, and he put his hoof on it.
This one,
he decreed before tearing into the paper and beholding his first gift of the day. BB was more than a little thrilled with his assortment of gifts. There was a collection of frisbees that was sort of a joint present for him and Buddha both, so that Eventide could play with the both of them in the yard. The second gift had been a box filled with a series of kids' novels about a mouse named Poppy and her many adventures in a wild forest. It came with drawings to depict some of the scenes, and had been from Fluttershy. The third present had been a box of puzzles and toys with moving pieces, including something called a Rubik's Cube. Eventide had reasoned that BB could play with them using his magic to get better at it, while also working out his brain with the logic side of things. BB spent maybe 10 minutes on the Rubik's Cube before he got frustrated with it and moved on. The fourth and final gift was a dark blue scarf and a lighter blue dog sweater at about the right size for BB. His old one had rapidly gotten too small for him, and so this was to be its replacement. Fluttershy had put it on him, and with a bit of help, managed to cut a couple holes in it for his wings before stitching the tears to prevent them from growing. Once all of the presents had been opened, they each ate a slice of cake and then stepped outside with Buddha to try out the new frisbees. They spent almost 2 hours on this alone, and they relished every moment of it. BB savored the time outside, something he had only gotten to do a little bit since they first showed up. He made sure to land and rest very frequently so that he could keep playing long into the day. Finally, as the sun was setting, BB's stamina had to run out. He came in for a landing, and his legs gave out under him. He collapsed into the grass, panting, but with a large smile on his face. He even managed to let out a few breathless laughs. But the little guy was all worn out, and he would not be doing any more active playing today. But instead of taking him inside, Eventide and Fluttershy instead chose to lie down on the grass with him and look up at the sky. The setting sun painted the heavens in many brilliant shades of orange and yellow, and a few wispy clouds that floated by turned a vivid and jaw-dropping pink. With time, what few clouds there were in the sky faded away, and the stars came out. It was beautiful, and BB's eyes went wide. After what felt like an eternity of just staring up at the heavens, BB spoke in a soft, mesmerized whisper.
I've never seen the stars like this before.
Fluttershy and Eventide glanced at him, curious. He shifted slightly and lifted a hoof to point.
It's really pretty. So much prettier than on TV. There's so many.
Eventide looked up at the sky as well, his smile growing. Yeah, it is. It's even prettier than it was in town, he mumbled. Seeing that this far from town, without the light pollution, he could see many, many more stars than he was used to. It blew him away, making him feel small. It's beautiful. The family was quiet for a good long while, before Eventide reached out and took BB's hoof in his hand. The bug looked over at him curiously, and Eventide smiled back. Happy birthday, BB, he whispered while giving the hoof a gentle squeeze. BB smiled and nodded slowly.
Thank you, Teddy.
At some point, BB fell asleep on the grass. He slept through Fluttershy leaving to go back to her own home, and was still sound asleep as Eventide quietly carried him down the stairs and into the basement. Once he reached the bottom of the steps, Eventide flicked a light switch, and a single overhead light sprang into life, illuminating the room. It was empty and boring for the most part, save for a few boxes of leftover items from moving day that had yet to be given a proper place. To the left of the stairs was a bland gray wall with an unassuming wooden door. Eventide slowly walked over and opened it, careful not to disturb the sleeping creature in his arms. Beyond the door was BB's bedroom. The layout had been carefully arranged to be as close to his old room as possible, with his bed pressed up into the far right corner, his end table and lamp right next to it, and all of his toy boxes on the left side of the room. The walls and floor were still drab and boring gray, but they had plans to liven things up in the near future. But for now, Eventide's focus was on the bed. Gingerly, he set BB down beneath the covers and tucked him in. BB murmured something in his sleep, then snuggled into his blankets, but did not wake. Eventide stood and backed away to the open door of the room and just watched his son sleeping for a few minutes. Good night, BB. I love you. Happy birthday. And with that, he closed the door, leaving BB to his peaceful sleep.